titles yesterday, but they have those titles back, so you can get them up at the bookstore. To introduce this grand fellow here, we have another grand fellow that's following his footsteps, Zeke West.
Hello, everybody. Well, just here introducing my father and our house's resident smartass. So, fortunately, I don't have all too much to say about this grand fellow here, but, well, here's my dad.
Well, that was good, because if I'd introduced myself, it would be this glowing report that would probably take up 20 minutes of my talk, so now I'm introduced. To begin with, a couple of announcements. One that Shock should have made, but he was so greedy for time that he didn't talk about it, so now I have to. And that is that the long-awaited GEO panel that we've been talking about for 4 or 5 years, we are now actively pursuing. This has not taken place. Everyone says, why don't those guys let you in with your geologist? For a change, it's not the Egyptologist's fault, it's ours. And specifically mine, because I'm one of these rare people born with not just one, but 2 Achilles heels, and both of them are organization. So we have managed not to get this thing off the ground, but now we are really actively pursuing it. Shock and I have put the language together to go after. I think maybe not all of you know this, what we want to do, and we have a verbal agreement with Zahi Hawass, who, as many of you may know, but some of you may not know, I now have, through a remarkable miracles do happen, and we are now on quite good, even better than amiable personal terms. He still trashes everything alternative in public, but on a personal level, we're getting on quite well. And in fact, recently he was in Sedona with the person who does, my friend who does my trips for me, Mohammed Nazmi, and I got a call from Mohammed saying, got to call Zahi quick. He wants to invite you personally to this big party that they're having at the Metropolitan Museum of Art when they're opening up this new Luxor museum. So I will be there next week, personally invited by Zahi Hawass, and there will be there. This should be a lot of fun, because it's going to be filled with rich sponsors of the Met who are there on the special thing with a private viewing and all the rest. But there will certainly be a few quackademic Egyptologists there who are going to say, I hope, and say, what the hell are you doing here? And I will say with a big smile, oh, Zahi invited me, of course. So we'll see. But the GEO panel is serious business, and we are going to put, the idea is that we have 3 or 4, depending upon what the budget will handle, geologists who are either openly on our side or open to it, and 3 or 4 chosen by Zahi or whoever he delegates, who are committed against it to spend 12 days, 2 weeks, mainly on the Giza Plateau, but also Dashur and Saqqara. And geologists move as slowly as mountains, so it's going to take 2 weeks to go through every point and every bit of the evidence that Shock was showing you yesterday, and then do reports, and then call a press conference, and if the outcome is as unconditionally positive as we expect it to be, that jump-starts the whole process of the quest for the lost civilization, because the Sphinx is not the most important piece. I mean, it's one of the most important pieces of evidence, but the things that you've been hearing over yesterday, for example, there's plenty of other solid evidence attesting to a lost civilization that went down. But the Sphinx, anybody can understand. It's a no-brainer. Our mystery of the Sphinx is shown in schools by teachers to 6th graders and 7th graders, and they get it. Egyptologists and archaeologists don't get it, but the kids do. So getting this panel off the ground is of paramount importance. And now that I've got you all in this room, Jacques and I discussed, if any of you know, any of you have academic credentials, any of you have a geologist in the family with the right kind of credentials, or a friend who has a friend who has a friend who knows a geologist who might be interested in joining us, pass the word around and they can get hold of us through my website or Jacques or something like that. We're opening this up. We'll be putting ads in the geological journals. We'll be putting notices up on our websites, on Graham's, on Robert's, on Daily Grail. So we're really pursuing this in a big-time way now. We're going to go get it. And second thing is, some of you may or may not know that I have a nonprofit foundation called the Ancient Wisdom Foundation, which is always looking for a friendly billionaire to sort of put up some of what I call wolf repellent, which greases the wheels so that life can go on. Third thing is, as you know, I do my trips, and I have them planned for the next one. Actually starts October 23rd, but there is room on there. If anybody wants to jump up right now and write out a check, I can get you on that one. Otherwise, December, January, February, there are trips. If you haven't seen Egypt through symbolist eyes, even if you've been there, you really haven't seen it at all. And I'm getting on. I mean, as long as I can climb up the Red Pyramid, I'll keep doing them. But the situation in the Mideast is such that who knows, and my feeling is that if you're going to go, you better do it sometime fairly soon while the getting's good, because I don't trust the situation. When you get to Egypt itself, I mean, you don't feel dangerous. You get there 2 days, and unless you've got CNN on, you say, this is the safest place I've ever been in. I feel much safer than I do walking around in Los Angeles. But anyway, so those are the three announcements. Now, with this talk, I'm going to start, I hope, if I can manage to keep to the schedule, the first 20 minutes or so. Symbolist Egypt, Jacques handled all of the geology, and so I don't have to go into that now. Here's our picture of the Sphinx, which anchors the whole, let's say, the whole quest for the ancient civilization. But it's the doctrine that is associated with it that establishes the importance of it, because if it's just an old ancient civilization that died, it's a curiosity. If that ancient civilization enshrines a doctrine that is of immediate consequence to us as living human beings in the 21st century, that's another matter altogether. And I share Graham's, and I guess most of the other presenters' views of our contemporary society, which I regard as an absolute madhouse and in steep decline. As far as I'm concerned, Western civilization is probably the worst catastrophe to hit the human race since monogamy. And it is a morass. And getting out of it, this will be the second part of the talk. The only way out of it, I mean, nobody's going to stop global warming. Nobody's going to produce to bring down the population from the crowded, from the 6 billion that it is now. Nobody's going to do any of these things physically, probably, or nobody's even going to realize, or not enough people are going to realize that it has to be done before it's too late. But it can be approached through ideas. And I'll get into this later. First, I'll talk about symbolist Egypt itself, concentrating or emphasizing the doctrine itself and the cosmological aspects of it. And then we'll do a quick run-through of Egypt itself, because that's probably the only civilization when we've talked about a few of the presenters, the Kali Yuga, the Yuga cycle, that it's a progression, that it is a cycle that goes like this, up and down. And for the most part, it's hard to appreciate that visually, even textually, and it's a very complicated subject. But when you go through Egypt from beginning to end, and let's say the Sphinx here, This is the beginning, way, 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 way back. Oh, yeah. I'll interrupt myself for a second here. Graham was talking about this 10,500 date, Robert also, because that's a Leo marker. We've had this discussion a lot, but I'd just like to say, and I won't go into the documentation, but the Egyptian texts have this documentation that I think even 10,500 is too early. This big catastrophe hits about 12,000, whatever it is, 12,000, 11,500 BC, the comet strike or whatever it is. Ice Age comes to an end. All the quaternary extinctions, all the woolly mammoths and the rhinoceroses and all the huge land mammals die. There's chaos all over the earth, and this is around that 10,500 date. So I don't think that the human race is in any position to put up Sphinx and pyramids around that date. On the other hand, the Leo marker is very convincing. The knowledge of precession established in very ancient times is now, I feel, quite commanding. Hamlet's mill has been implemented by a number of very profound and very coherent and cogent scholarly works. So I think the Sphinx should go back still another precessional age to 36,000 BC, which strangely enough correlates to Egyptian texts themselves and to references in the Vedas that talk about the establishment of Vedic civilization around 40,000 years ago. This is one of those things that at some point we hope to address with our geo panel. In any event, so Egypt is at its Egypt as an exemplar of the Kali Yuga or of the Yuga cycle in action is a very, the picture is worth 1,000 words, they say. I don't know if it's worth 1,000 of my words, but nevertheless, the pictures are the pictures. And so we will go through now the sort of, I call it the sacred chronology or the sacred cosmology of Egypt. Okay, and this all begins with the genius with the unpronounceable name, R.A. Schwala-Dulubich, who, as a practicing alchemist and expert in the Hermetic sciences in 1937, went with his wife and stepdaughter to Luxor, and in walking through the temple of Luxor, he was fully prepared. I didn't know this. Is something I just realized recently. An interesting book that came out in France on Schwaller and the Alchemical Revival. It's a book called Fulcanelli and the Alchemical Revival by a woman named Geneviève Dubois. I don't know if they've got it in the bookstore here, but anybody seriously interested in the whole Schwaller saga should look into that one. So anyway, apparently, contrary to what I originally had been told, Schwaller was prepared to see in Egypt the source of the Hermetic practices, alchemy, astrology, magic, and so on, that he was, Neoplatonism, that he was so involved in France shortly after the turn of the last century. And it was in Luxor, in this strange asymmetric temple, that he walked through and had what mystics call a revelation, and artists call an inspiration, and scientists call a hypothesis formation, to make it sound as boring as possible. And that hypothesis formation was that this weird ruined structure, and believe me, when you walk through there, you wouldn't see this unless you were prepared for it, an exercise in mathematical harmony and proportion. This started a long saga, 15 years on the site, in which Schwaller had access to precise measures of the temple, and what he was looking for initially was simply the Egyptian knowledge and employment of the golden section, phi, which has been known to artists, and it's supposedly actually a discovery of Pythagoras, and Schwaller wanted to see if the Egyptians had used it before. So within a very short space of time, a month or so, we realized not only did the Egyptians have the golden section, they also had the diatonic scale and several other musical scales as well, and that these were employed or deployed or commanded the proportions of this extraordinary temple in a manner so sophisticated that it was way beyond anything the Greeks later used. And this is not trashing the Greeks. The Greeks themselves, there's an excellent book called Black Athena, the Afro-Asiatic roots of Greek civilization, by a very solid scholar called Martin Bernal, which demonstrates that the Greeks, as the Greeks themselves acknowledged their wisdom came out of Egypt, and maybe other places in the Middle East, and that Egypt truly was the fount of ancient wisdom, at least in that area of the world. The Chinese and the Indians had the same doctrine as well. We'll get into that in the second part of this talk. So here are, and then Schwaller realized, having, sorry, this one. And you see that the skeleton is, or the temple is superimposed upon the skeleton, the human skeleton. That's actually a male skeleton. The proportions of a woman's body are different from the proportions of a man's, altogether different. And so this is the temple of man, and this is why Schwaller called it the temple of man. People always say, is there a temple of woman? Maybe. The temple of Isis could be the temple of woman, but nobody has done this kind of harmonic geometric analysis of it. So Schwaller found that it's not supposed to be a model of the human body. I mean, they could have done a huge temple shaped like a human body, but the proportions and the symbolism employed throughout the temple is, you might say, establishes or the totality of the cosmological laws, the relationship as above, so below. We are, Schwaller called his own doctrine, the anthropocosmos. In other words, the man cosmos. If we understand ourselves well enough, we understand everything there is to understand in the universe, and if we do our inner work the way that we're supposed to, which is what the Egyptian doctrine is in its entirety. Schwaller calls the Egyptian doctrine to avoid specific religious symbolism, which is a good thing to do, because you talk about one religion, everyone thinks you're trashing the others. Schwaller calls it the return to the source. The doctrine basically is that we're on this earth for a purpose. We are not accidental glitches in a meaningless universe, no more than cerebrating apes, as it were. We have a purpose, and over and above the rest of the animal kingdom. Nowadays, interesting work on dolphins and whales shows that they're pretty advanced in their own way, but for argument's sake, let's say we have a job to do that we're supposed to do cosmologically, philosophically, spiritually, and if we don't do it, the universe is in trouble. Not just us. We're in real trouble, but everything's in trouble if we don't do our work, and that work is the return to the divine source. Simple as that. Easy to express, difficult to do. Somebody once said, I haven't been able to track the reference down, that golf is a very easy game that's very difficult to play. So it is with any kind of inner work. Sounds easy, not easy. So we start off, and these bizarre, everything in Egypt, I mean, you look at it, go there for the first time, it looks like magic. I mean, it's so alien. Of course, we've all seen a million Egypt pictures, but it's so alien to our consciousness and our way of approaching our daily life that even when it's explained, and of course, it take a lot of explaining to go into all of these hieroglyphs, which anyway I couldn't explain because I don't have the hieroglyphs. When I need translations, I go to friends of mine who are experts. But this starts off, this is a cosmological drawing, you wouldn't know it, relief on one of the Ramses tombs. And without elaborating upon it, in one of the cosmological myths, Atum, who is the god before there were any gods, Schwaller terminology, he represents unpolarized consciousness. In other words, before there's a male and a female, before there's a positive and a negative, the universe is one. This corresponds to the void of Hinduism, the Tao of Taoism, etc., etc., etc. All cosmologies virtually start off from this point or something very similar. And he creates the first couple, who are Shu and Tefnut, through an act of masturbation, because it's the only way in which love can express itself, actually, when there's just one. And over here, well, it's good that there are two, because So, and what's interesting here is, I mean, a lot of things that are interesting, but these little serpents on their tails with the divine heads on them are called the sperm of Atum. Now, these are sperm cells, very clearly. They're not normal cobras or the other kinds of serpents that you see in Egypt. The texts say very clearly these are the sperm of Atum. How do they know that? It takes a pretty powerful microscope to know what a sperm cell looks like. A very powerful microscope. But they know it. And they know it in, I think I know how they know it, and maybe I'll get into it later. We'll see, because time goes on. So anyway, that's the beginning of the universe, as it were, or one of the, the Egyptians have several cosmological myths that complement each other. They don't, it's not that they were warring priests, as the Egyptologists would believe, but rather that they're coming at the same story from different points of view. Okay, and now we're more in cosmology. Unfortunately, it's stuff like this that New Age factions get hold of, and there's a whole big palaver out there that this is really a cathode ray tube. And it sort of looks like a cathode ray tube, but it isn't. It's in the bowels of the earth. It's in one of the crypts of Dendera. And you see what it is? It's a serpent, which actually, according to Schwaller, the water snake represents the first wave form energy after the first, in other words, another way of expressing the first male and the first female, because a wave form is positive and negative. And you see that coming out of a lotus flower is another cosmological symbol, symbolizing actually its roots are in the earth. It grows through the water. It flowers in the air, and it sends out the sort of the odor of sanctity. This exquisite perfume. If you're a cartoonist, how do you draw a smell? This is the odor. This is the envelope of fragrance that surrounds the lotus, which recent scholarship has shown the blue lotus is, in fact, has hallucinogenic properties. So I'm very busy when I'm in Egypt trying to get some blue lotus so far without too much success. Now we continue. Now we're going through the cosmology. There is Tauret, the hippo, the crocodile on her back. At the axis is an astronomical ceiling. This is the axis of the universe. Tauret represents becoming, pregnancy, gestation, birth. This crocodile, for obvious reasons, represents death. So here you have wedded together the central principle of life in the universe anywhere. And a word here, we'll go through a little bit more of this as we go along. The animals are chosen by the Egyptians very carefully because they embody, they're not worshipping animals as the academics would have. The animals embody, are the best example of the embodiment of what you should embody a certain principle in. So the hippo represents pregnancy and gestation, because what could be more pregnant than a pregnant hippo? And also because it's the only animal, the only land animal that gives birth to its young in the water. And life springs from the primeval waters, even in today's evolutionary theory. They talk about the prebiotic soup, which Campbell's used to produce in the very old days. Now, more cosmology. This is Nut, the sky, who in Egypt is feminine, and Geb, the earth, underneath, who is masculine, often shown with an enormous phallus. So this may be one of the expressions of the fall of man, and I'm not being casual there, actually. But it's very peculiar. It works both ways. We used to talking about Mother Earth, but it's equally valid to talk about the sky as the matrix of all. Actually, it's probably more accurate, and the inseminating agency as masculine. Anyway, that's how the Egyptians did it. This is a ceiling, and this is off one of the papyruses. Now, further down in the cosmology, this is processional. The ram of Ammon. Ammon takes over as the chief deity or the chief principle of Egypt. Remember, I didn't say this. As soon as you call the gods, it sounds superstitious. If you think of them as cosmic or organic principles, suddenly it throws the whole discussion into another category. So Amun becomes, around 2000 BC, the chief principle or guiding religious principle of Egypt, and his symbol, one of his two symbols, is the ram. He's referred to as the great ram in the sky. Well, that matches almost exactly the ingress into Aries, and the great ram in the sky almost screams out procession to you. And we continue. Now we're into some of the gods and the goddesses themselves and why they're chosen for their role. This is Sekhmet, who is the consort of Ptah. Ptah is the architect of heaven and earth, and he's always shown in mummy wrappings with only his hands free, clutching the emblems of power. It is Sekhmet, his consort, who does all of the work, and she is the lioness. She's also the goddess of vengeance, or associated with vengeance, retribution, war, etc., and healing, but healing by fire. And she's a lioness because, again, in real life, the lion, the male lion, has a good time of it. He just sits there doing nothing. He doesn't do any of the hunting. His basic job is to keep the other males off the ladies, and the female does all of the work and all of the nurture and all of everything that has to be done. So the Egyptians were quite wise. That's how it should be done. And see, if I had longer now, I'd tell a whole bunch of jokes about this sort of subject. But we don't have long enough. Okay, now here's Hathor with her cows, with the strange triangular face, which looks very un-Egyptian, and her cow's ears, the strange headdress, and column going down here. This is one of the most interesting symbols of Egypt, and interestingly enough, a couple of women on successive trips a few years ago solved the problem of that face of Hathor's, and I won't go into it's a fairly long story, and I don't want to get into it, but in a nutshell, Hathor is also the only one of the gods and goddesses who has a whole column to herself. None of the other gods is there a column. Everything is lotus and papyrus, again, for symbolic reasons. But to cut it short, Hathor is one of the expressions of the cosmic feminine. Her name actually means Hathor, means the mother of Horus. And this was solved, what that face was, and the relationship to the cow was solved by a couple of women on my trips, as I said. One of them looked at this face, and I talked about Dendera, which is where the New Year was born. It was celebrated in Egypt. So it's the birth of the New Year, and by extension, the birth of the cosmos, celebrated at Dendera. And earlier on, again, another woman on my trip said, well, John, the place is as dark and as not oppressive, but it's a very dark place. And she said, because it's the womb of time. It's meant to be dark. And then on another trip, years later, I was talking about this story, but still this mystery of this weird face. And she said, well, John, look at the shape of it. It's the shape of a uterus, and those are the fallopian tubes. And I said, right, perfect. The mother of all, the cosmic feminine, is in the shape of a uterus. And still another woman came along on another trip and said, yes, but it's a pregnant uterus, mother of Horus, house of Horus, not a deflated Horus, which in fact, when you see a schematic of it, looks exactly like a cow's skull. So all of a sudden the symbolism makes perfect sense. And then I did my homework and found that actually an Egyptologist had noted that some 60 years ago, an expert on talismans, but nobody had paid any attention to him. In fact, uterus symbolism was common through the ancient world. He wrote a book, or a long paper, called Uterine Symbolism in the Ancient World. So this stuff has been around forever, and we only go by fits and starts piecemeal, rediscovering it. Now, more things. These are the rearing cobras at Saqqara. These represent, same as in India, the Kundalini energy risen to the third eye. You see other illustrations of the pharaoh's diadem with the cobra coming from the third eye. Why should that be? Well, because the Egyptians understood the same understanding as the Hindus, just expressed differently, of the Kundalini energy. So all of this stuff is known in ancient times. Now we have more symbols. I want to get going here, so we're going to skip some stuff. Okay, this is the weighing of the heart. This is the weighing of the heart. The heart, this becomes Judgment Day in Christianity. Christianity actually, has its roots in Egypt. There's a ton of material on this. Basically, you could say that at its best, Christianity is remedial Egypt. It's Egypt that's lost the science. And Judaism is actually portable Egypt. You can take it into the desert with you. You don't need a temple to celebrate it in. Anyway, the heart is the seat of conscience, which recently actually is getting some press, that the heart is not just something that pumps blood. It actually is, it has, let's say, its psychological qualities. It's being established. The heart has to not outweigh the feather of justice or the feather of truth. If it does, whoever the deceased is gets thrown to this composite monster animal here called Amit, the eater of the dead. And effectively, it doesn't mean that you go to hell. You go to Los Angeles, actually. You don't go to hell, but your name dies. It's as though you have never lived. It's oblivion. Now, we go back. I mean, that's how, basically, that's the shortest possible version of the cosmology that goes from the foundation or creation of the universe to the role of humanity within the cosmic scheme. Our job is to arrive at a level of consciousness that does not die. That's what immortality is all about. It's not that the physical body lives on. The physical body feeds the worms. But the spiritual body, if developed, and this is the whole purpose of the Pharaoh, if developed, feeds the gods, literally. So we got a choice as people. We can either feed the worms, well, it's not either or, we're going to feed the worms, but we can feed the gods, and the text, the Egypt texts are very explicit, that the king who represents is not the only one who reaches that state of spiritual enlightenment, but he's the prototype. And the idea is that his name, in other words, his identity, lives forever. That is the purpose of the exercise. It has not gone away. It's expressed very differently. We could be doing it today if we knew what we were doing, but mostly we don't. Anyhow, I'll get back to this momentarily in a minute or two. So here's our run-through of Egypt, descending through. We start with the Sphinx, that's the earliest bit, and we go through. I mean, when we're in Egypt on our trips, you see this, in 3 dimensions, and it's a very moving experience. Sphinx, and also these wonderful photographs taken by a friend of mine Sarit Sanders in infrared photography, having a book coming out very shortly, published by American University Press. Really has the infrared captures things that are not otherwise easy to catch. Here's a mock-up of Saqqara, 2700 BC, when Egypt is supposedly just beginning. Frank Lloyd Wright would have given his right arm to have produced a structure that looks like that. Inlaid eyes made of 4 kinds of quartz crystal, also Old Kingdom. In order to produce these eyes, they have to know not just the anatomy of the eye, but its refractive and reflective indexes. And it's quartz crystal, very difficult to work with. Hatshepsut's temple, 1500 BC, another instance of something that looks as though Frank Lloyd Wright or some modernist could have produced it. Now we're getting into the columns of Karnak, these enormous columns. Karnak represents the papyrus swamp, or this particular hypostyle hall where organic life starts. Here's Ramses II, Abu Simbel, a magnificent temple. But in this picture, you don't see the scale. There's the scale. Now we're going further in. We're in Ptolemaic times. You see that it's getting corrupted and busy. These are Napoleon's draftsmen showing you the levels where the sand was when he went through there. Now we're down to Roman times, and you get a sense of what's degenerating, what's higher and what's lower. This guy looks like he just came back from the orgy and didn't enjoy it either. This is the temple. This is the garden at the Museum of Alexandria. The Great Sphinx has turned into Tony the Tiger. Now we're at the last gasp of Egyptian civilization. This is the catacombs of Komo-Chukafa, 2nd, I think, century AD, and it's a private tomb in the family of here. It's kind of an underground Disneyland of these corrupted Egyptian, or mixture of ancient Egyptian symbolism and Hellenic and Roman influences, and it's kind of ghoulish looking when you're down there. Interesting, but not enlightening. And then another actually interesting aspect, because Christianity comes and takes over, And the Christians are always blamed for this strange, careful effacing. But in fact, it's something, maybe the only thing in the history of the last 2,000 years, the only desecration that you can't blame on the Christians. In fact, this is the thing I've been working on for years, and there's no time to go in for it now. When Egypt's time was over, it was the Egyptian priests themselves that came and selectively, not everywhere, some went and effaced certain figures and left others right next to them uneffaced. It wasn't that they were trying to get rid of the pagans. It was the Egyptian priests themselves decommissioning their temples. And it would be a very interesting PhD study in that to figure out what got defaced and what didn't get defaced and why. Now, the Christians actually take over certain of the temples. Here, the Byzantine cross is inscribed into one of the pillars of one of the columns of Philae Temple. Things are going along, and over here is the ultimate decline of the of the great Egyptian pantheon and gods. Here they are on a cloth on the back of a camel. So much for the gods of Egypt. Fortunately, Graham read that wonderful passage from the Hermetica yesterday about the decline of Egypt and the revival of the cosmos, which is one of the most moving passages in all of literature as far as I'm concerned, so I'm spared reading you that, except I want to go back just to the one line in that again refers to what I've been talking about, the whole doctrine, and that is when Jehuti, when Hermes Trismegistus says to Thoth, who is Jehuti, an ancient Egyptian, as for the soul and the belief that it is immortal by nature, or may strive to become so. That is the key line, or may strive to become so. No striving, no soul, no anything. And then, finally, where are we? Back to our Sphinx. And that completes, you might say, the cycle. And you can see in front of your eyes how you can see it from the height achieved by the Sphinx down through, or maybe coevally with the pyramids, and ends up as the gods on the back of a camel. And if anything visually, I've never seen anything visually that, let's say, carries that message more, and I have lots of other slides that I could have put in here and along the lecture, that conveys that message of decline, of spiritual decline, as well as this trip through Egypt does. Okay, so and then what happens now, so Sphinx starts it all off, and it goes down through its thing. Here are the symbols of that return to the source, the scarab beetle, which represents the transformation of matter, lays its eggs in a bowl of dung. Eventually the eggs hatch. They spin a little bit of a cocoon, and it's a dung beetle, and eventually the metamorphosed larva or nymph of the dung beetle breaks through its cocoon, looks exactly like a mummy actually, and flies off into the air, a winged creature and therefore spirit. And then the ultimate transformation we were talking about before is that of humanity. The texts say the deified king becomes a star and sails across the sky in the company of Ra and his boat of millions of years. And what happens is here is the relationship. In other words, our job is to acquire stellar consciousness. And here you see unmistakable papyrus of this connection between star and human consciousness. As soon as you see that, you see an illustration of the esoteric doctrine that we're supposed to be doing in life. So that's the end of part one, which of course has taken me much longer than it should. And now we go into part two, which is the A word, Atlantis. This little drawing here is, or picture, I don't know who did it. It was somebody sent it to me from the net. But this is a very careful, it looks pretty modern, rendition. What did I do? Oh no. Did I hit the wrong thing? What is that? I hit something. How do I get that back up there, Jeff? I did something wrong. Did I hit the button of death? Oh my God. Huh. Okay, it'll come back. There's no more, I don't have any more documentation for Atlantis because there is none. But that is a rendition, that's a very careful reproduction of Plato's description of Atlantis. The entire Atlantis myth, or the entire story of Atlantis, comes to us only from Plato himself, though there are loads and loads and loads of references throughout mythology of lost civilizations and all the rest, but Atlantis itself comes to us only through Plato. Now that has generated, can I have the lights on? Well, when you get ready, Jeff, are we back there? What happened? That's okay. Only through Plato do we have that Atlantis myth. And for Atlantology, the hunt for Atlantis, really begins seriously only in 1888 when Ignatius Donnelly, a remarkable man and a remarkable scholar, wrote his book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, where he found a lot of evidence. I'm not going into that evidence now, but subsequently, anyway, this is what Atlantis is supposed to look like according to artist's impression of what Atlantis is supposed to look like according to Plato. So Ignatius Donnelly wrote his book, and then sporadically over the years, over the next century, a number of people have gone looking for Atlantis. Story came out, Edgar Cayce had his own channeled vision of Atlantis, and people have gone looking around, and various candidates have come up. In Bimini, divers went off Bimini where Cayce said it was supposed to be, and found some artifacts of sort, and these were trashed by geologists, but now it turns out really that the geologists themselves were doing a hatchet job. There is something there. But in the last 10 years or so, a whole bunch of different candidates have come up for Atlantis. And you may have seen some of it, particularly on the web, but sometimes it makes press in the mainstream press. And the candidates are numerous: Atlantic Ocean, Antarctica, Arctic Circle, Ireland, Spain, Cyprus, coast of Cuba. The trouble with all of these are interesting. All but one off the coast of Cuba, is probably an ancient civilization of some sort. But what the Atlantologists do, unfortunately, is they take what corresponds to Plato's myth as their evidence, and they ignore what doesn't work. I mean, it's supposed to be half again the size of Egypt and Libya combined. It's supposed to have a maritime, another candidate is the Altiplano of Peru and Bolivia, yet it's supposed to be a maritime nation. So all of the, let's say, the proponents of the various theories take what fits and leave what doesn't fit, but really they're all auditioning to be Plato's Atlantis, and none of them have got the role, actually. And there is a book published about the same time I published Serpent in the Sky that is apparently virtually unknown, and that throws the whole hunt for Atlantis into a different category. Has anyone in the audience heard of a book called The Pythagorean Plato by Ernest G. McLean? No. Part of the reason why you haven't heard of that book is because of me. I read this book when I came out, and briefly, I'll only read a couple of little selections because I see I'm running out of time as always. McLean is if he's still alive, it'd be in his late 80s, a musicologist and a Sufi, and a very astute and erudite musicologist. And in his book, called The Pythagorean Plato, he argues and demonstrates that Plato is not referring to a physical Atlantis, but rather that his story of Atlantis, with all of this precise data, one of the clues that he's right is that if you read the Timaeus, it's very, very accurate. I mean, this guy couldn't have done this drawing accurately without Plato's description. And I mean, there are so many boulevards, and there are so many moats, and there are so many bridges, and the measures for each of these, every element within Atlantis is meticulously noted. Now, this is next to impossible to hand down orally not necessarily, you could do it, because in the old days memory was a cultivated faculty, human faculty, but it doesn't make any sense to hand it down for Atlantis. So basically what MacLean is arguing is that Plato was actually providing for a musically educated audience an allegory of a political allegory of how a city should be and what happens when it becomes degenerate. And Atlantis is the luxury city that becomes degenerate and disappears under the oceans in one fell swoop virtually overnight. Now, I knew about this book way back then, and I didn't include it in, well, I guess it came out after Serpent, or anyway, I didn't read it till after Serpent. And then I heard through mutual friends, because I was absolutely convinced that MacLean was right, that it had to be correct. And I have a mutual friend who said that the whole Sphinx theory was published, but only in the Serpent, so nobody knew about it, and that MacLean had absolutely no interest in a possible historical Atlantis. And even in the Serpent, I carefully note it within inverted quotes, because it's not necessarily a specific place, but a lost civilization. And MacLean wasn't interested, and I didn't go after him. Actually, probably, I can't even remember, but probably because I didn't have Shock on my side yet, so it had no academic backup. And then I just forgot about it, and over the course of several writing appendices for Serpent, I could have noted it, but I just forgot, and then with this latest 10 years spate of Atlantologists coming up with Cyprus and Ireland and Altiplano of Peru, I suddenly remembered, gee, it's high time to get something to publish, because this is a very obscure book, and it is in print, that this should be entered into the equation, and anybody looking for Atlantis should read this first and see if they can refute it in any way, shape, or form. Now, I have some passages here that I was hoping to read, but of course, windbag that I am, I go on much too long, and the passages take too long to read. So you'll just have to take. I mean, it doesn't matter, because what the passages do is simply express the fantastically complex musicology or musical analogy that MacLean derives from that Atlantis myth, and he can't be wrong. I mean, everything fits, and it relates different kinds of Greek tuning systems that are well known to each other, and the tuning system that applies to Atlantis is different, which is the civilization that dies of its own excess. Sounds sort of like today. And just the Pythagorean tuning that is effectively eternal, because it's a city based upon necessity, as it were, and the worship of the gods. And the whole thing makes perfect sense. So anybody keen on Atlantis should get themselves a copy of the Pythagorean Plato, and I think it should, if the word gets out, all Atlantis hunters should read this book before they do any more hunting, which doesn't mean that they shouldn't hunt, because the things that are being found, and there should be, if the Sphinx theory is correct, plenty of stuff under the water. Graham was illustrating some of that yesterday. It almost certainly isn't the Atlantis that Plato was inventing. He took the story, as he said, probably from Solon, as the bare bones of a civilization that went down under catastrophic conditions, and then converted it into a musical analogy for the instruction and amusement of his own pupils, who were highly musically educated. So, very interesting. Now, 10 minutes for the magical mystery topic. Civilization, any society, is based upon ideas. Sometimes it doesn't look it, like ours, for example, looks like an absence of ideas. Nevertheless, every civilization is based upon ideas. Victor Hugo, the French poet, André Gide said, notre meilleur poète, hélas, our greatest poet, alas. It's sort of a French Milton. But he said there is one thing strong, most of you will have heard this, there is one thing stronger than all of the armies in the world, and that is an idea whose time has come. Good Victorian that he was, Hugo rather assumed, or seems to have assumed, that an idea whose time has come is a better idea than the idea it replaces. This is not necessarily so. Fascism was an idea. Hitler was the expression of an idea. This is not a good idea. We now live in what I call the Church of Progress. And the Church of Progress has its own Jesuits. They are science, education, and the press. And it expresses a particular set of ideas. Our society is what it is because of certain ideas. There is no God, there is no divine. Sacred is another polite word for superstition. Everything is material. If it isn't scientific, if it isn't scientifically demonstrated or demonstrable, it doesn't exist. It's superstition. Basically, more is better. And above all, or let's say underlying all of this, the idea that evolution goes in a straight line and progress is evidence of, even though certain Darwinians would deny that this is what they're doing, they are doing it. And they are basically saying that civilization goes from a straight line from dumb old cavemen to smart old us with our progress and our wonderful civilization and our ability to produce hydrogen bombs and bobblehead dolls and striped toothpaste and Disneyland and Hollywood. And this is the best we've ever done. I mean, we can do still better, but this is a big improvement over Egypt and medieval Europe, where it was nothing but superstition. Underlying what buttresses this entire Church of Progress, the dogma of the Church of Progress, is one single doctrine, actually you might call it, or one single theory, which is the Darwinian theory of evolution. And this is called, I don't know how many of you have been following the debate which has heated up over the last few years of intelligent design versus Darwinism. Unfortunately, because science makes the dogma, education inculcates it, and the media disperses it, the intelligent design guys who have, the evidence is all on their side in a certain way, but basically they don't know how to fight. They're sort of like Democrats. Democrats of science. They simply don't know how to get their own words, their own evidence out there. And, well, it's a few minutes here. So this has been a hobby horse of mine for a long time, and as I said yesterday, what got me to shock, what convinced me that he was somebody I could work with, and he could work with me, was this dismissal of a very prominent, at the time, evolutionist, who wasn't even actually a biologist, many of them are. And so for a long time we've been thinking about, Jacques and myself, about doing a book to see if we could, I mean, there are loads of books from the time Darwin first put his theory out that would absolutely, there were books destroying the whole hypothesis from beginning to end, and simply got wiped under the rug. But nevertheless, maybe it's time, there comes a time when, even if somebody's been saying it forever, that there comes a time when you can actually make a difference, when you can get the word out there in a coherent way. So Jacques and I have been talking about doing something, but of course we have to keep it somewhat uninflammatory because we don't want to upset the Darwinians. So we have a projected title, which is Darwin Debunked, Darwin Declawed, Darwin Dethroned, Science and Scholarship Deconstruct the Cargo Cult of the West. So, now, in the couple of minutes that we have, because I wanted to go into more of this, I wasn't going to get into the evidence because that takes too long, but I want to approach this from a position that's, it's hard to imagine that somebody hasn't come up with this before. If you Google up evolution, you'll find 210 million hits or entries. I read through about 199 million of them, And I couldn't get it all in before coming here. And to the best of my knowledge, there's a key to exposing this fraud for what it is, and that key is language. Nobody has actually, the intelligent design guys get suckered into using the Darwinian-owned terminology. And basically what that terminology is, unfortunately, really need more time, but I'm not going to have it. Unfortunately, what that terminology is the equivalent of Orwell's Newspeak, where words that mean one thing are used to mean exactly the opposite. For example, democracy, freedom. This is Newspeak when you see the kind of democracy that are around and the freedoms that we actually have. So with Darwinism, the key to that, the key word, Darwin's own word, is natural selection. This is used as a synonym for creation or evolution through a series. I don't know how many of you know Richard Dawkins and or Daniel Dennett, his colleague, who are, I call them the co-commandants of the latter-day Darwin Jugend. And it is Dennett who coined the word, arguing with some very erudite opponent of Darwinism. Well, science knows it's just a series of lucky coincidences. If suddenly you called it the theory of lucky coincidences, the whole thing would start sounding somewhat less scientific. But if you look at natural selection, you see that natural is used as a synonym for accident, for haphazard. Well, the objective of the exercise is to prove that nature is an accident. If you call the defendant at a jury trial the guilty, the trial is over before it begins. And nature is nothing but an exquisitely organized, hierarchically perfect conglomeration. In other words, it's perfect organization, and you can't call it natural. You have to prove that it just happens. The same applies to selection. The roulette ball does not select the number it's going to fall on, nor does the croupier select the number it's going to fall on. Candidates are selected to run for office. Candidates are selected for the NBA draft. Selection presupposes a conscious and deliberate choice. Nature presupposes organized, highly organized structures. That evolution takes place. In other words, that there is a kind of development. Yes, this is certainly the case. But the agency that is responsible for this organization is absolutely unknown. And here the Darwinists pull a trick. I think the Darwinians were probably responsible for getting George Bush into office, because they use the same logic. Either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. Either you're with us or you're with the creationists. No, why can't you be against both? I am. So, to cut it short, look at this, I'm going to cut right on time. Natural selection, when you look at it, natural selection is to science what Santa Claus is to Christmas. An indispensable marketing ploy. It is an indispensable marketing ploy with no observable validity. In other words, no one has ever observed natural selection at work. But Daddy, says your 5-year-old son, Santa Claus is everywhere. Look, he's at Walmart, he's at the mall, he's ringing a bell on the street. Of course there's a Santa Claus. But if you're a good daddy, you don't tell him that really Santa Claus is just a big fat guy who's out of work and conning your parents into getting you presents that you don't really need. So it's basically the same with evolution. Wait, let me just find this here. All right, quick. I have a line here. Wait a minute. Well, concluding line. Oh, well, wait a second. I had a concluding line to that. I just skipped out of my head this second. But basically, that's what it is. I mean, the 5-year-old son you leave with Santa Claus, but your 50-year-old Darwinian has to be shaken up and realize that the language he is using is inappropriate to what he is trying to demonstrate. If suddenly a language is taken on, and a series of lucky coincidences is called what it is, let's say haphazard, perfectly organized agglomeration. The whole thing falls into a linguistic shambles, and the entire fraud of an accidental universe, or of organisms arising by a series of lucky coincidences, simply disappears like Rumpelstiltskin and stamps its foot 3 times and disappears into the ground. Me personally, sometimes say, what would you like to achieve in your life, and blah, blah, blah. I would love to be the one who put an end to this hoax. So we'll finish with that. I'm sorry, could have used another half hour for Darwinism, but we'll see. Thank you.